connection. Yes, thank you. Fernando Salinan Ando is a marine geologist and river geologist. He works out of UPMSI. Rosa Perez is now with the observatory and actually consults with ATB. And we just lost the slide again. But has retired for many years at Pagasa as head of the Flood Research Division and now works out of the observatory. And Didi, as I mentioned, who's also in the room, actually heads the Climate Change Center. Where do we start? And I'll go through this very rapidly since Vivek has touched on this. Really, what's the distinction between global warming, variability, and change? Risk mapping, which is, and then look at slow onset versus rapid onset disasters. And some of the spatial tools that we began to develop to in fact help in the resilient science that we're trying to build. A few emerging points, and finally the last point, critical thinking is badly needed. Mitigation can be addressed primarily technologically, but adaptation is a social problem. You also, this already in essence with Vivek, so I won't go through that. And of course the coupling with carbon dioxide concentration and temperature change. Just on the sources of GHG emission, the Philippine government actually submits a policy submittal to the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. The observatory wrote the first submission. The second submission was parsed out to other people and among institutions, and we actually received the task to do the current inventory. And so if you want any information about that, it hasn't been officially released, but we can help you a little bit in the guidance on the sourcing and the distribution of those emissions. And we also did the vulnerability and adaptation mapping for the second national communication. And that some of that I'm going to be showing you today. A word about what's going on, global warming, clouds and water vapor. Dr. Eman Anglo used to head the Regional Climate Systems program of the observatory. He now is based in Canada, unfortunately, and consults for various organizations. However, he did feel that this was a very essential point to make, that, you know, there is uncertainty in the science, we don't fully understand feedbacks, there's all these worries about clouds, especially in the tropics. Vivek mentioned that in fact there is a very clear correlation between global warming and the strength of tropical cyclones in the Atlantic. It's not so easy in the tropics. So that correlation is still in the works. We can't say that because of the warming, our tropical cyclones are increasing. We still are trying to understand that correlation. And so I wanted to make that point, so to be a little bit careful on the scientific side about drawing those conclusions. However, the observations are that in fact there could be a correlation. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay. So you really have that sort of uncertainty still around. However, we do have observations that cannot be refuted. In 2000, Dr. Michael Manton, who works out of Monash University, got all these scientists who work for the Met agencies of the Asian countries together and said, just give me data on extremes. And so they began to document their extremes. And what has happened really for the Philippines, and Lourdes Tibig, by the way, who was working for Pag-asa then, is working for the observatory now, actually put together a data set which showed that there has been a rise in mean temperatures from 1960 to 98, and nearly all stations outside the urban areas. Why is that important? Urban areas have microclimates of their own, I'm sure you're aware of that. So taking a temperature in an urban area may not exactly be reflective, of course, of the general condition. So what they also found out was there were now more hot days, more warm nights, and fewer cold days and nights. Another thing they found out is, in fact, really the key point possibly is around, well, the 1970s, 1980s, when you see the temperatures actually go up. This data set actually is what the IPCC uses for the Philippines, and you do see those average annual temperatures of 95, and in fact, average summer temperatures already on the rise. In terms of the wet months and the dry months and rainfall, signals are not quite so clear, but then recently, in fact, this IPCC data is now in the process of being updated. You do have a signal on the wetter than usual wet season. The Manton study also noted that there was a decrease
very much for that informative sharing. We are now open for questions. Mr. Isaga will be leaving for Bangkok, so she's just a few minutes for this question and answer portion.
Can we have a copy of your presentation? It's not part of the materials. And obviously, our nature of business is not apparently climate change proof. Considering, given the risks and all the analysis presented, it's really an eye-opener, and it's quite alarming that in the projection presented, in 25 or 40 years' time, all our watershed, or at least the watershed and river basins we are depending on, will dry out, or significantly dry out. The question is, in our limited way, how can we combat these scenarios such that we'll have the business going in a sustainable manner?
I guess maybe the first answer to the question is, and of course this will betray my bias, we need to support local scientists, not anymore. Many of them are actually working together very, very significantly on tracking environmental changes in the Philippines. None of them work as in a local scientist versus foreign scientist alone, by the way, because it's through the foreign collaboration that we're able to get access, for example, to high-resolution satellite imagery, and some of that analysis really depends on access to that. There is a need to support institutional capacity, the scientific research institutions, and companies like yours, I think, would benefit directly from that. We're now working, for example, with IBM. IBM is talking to us about the smarter planet, this global movement, and we're really looking at models for coupling population growth, water demand, temperature change, rainfall change, and all of that work needs to be done. Without that work and the context-specific analysis that's needed here in the Philippines, your work will in fact be more difficult. And then we also urge companies like yours to work with the public sector goal in mind. We've been approached numerous times, I think, from both Manila and Manila Water. And the way we work as a scientific community is we need a public sector good, specific public sector good and application. So if you see the work that we did for Ayala Foundation, it actually went to the LGU, who was a partner. And so if you'd like to go further, I think, with the scientific community, that would really help to identify the public sector good or benefit and to work along those collaborative lines.
Thank you, ma'am. Because it must be also included and given utmost importance. Manila Water had actually initiated a CSR. We are adopting corporate social responsibility. And in fact, one of the projects we have now is reforestation of part of Marikina watershed. We have an initial of 500 hectares, and eventually we are targeting a total of 1,000 hectares. Although, given the magnitude of the situation, 1,000 hectares is surely not enough.
Well, we model. Okay, so when we talk about reforestation, we can actually be more focused. We have a general idea of how that actually is coupled. So forest and cover and temperature and precipitation change. And so there are actually models that will help you get a better focus on that work, which is, of course, admirable.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll hope to keep in touch with you in the future, more often than not. Thank you.
Your presentation was very informative and a lot of good assessments. I guess my question is there a government agency today or will we bring all the expertise in the country together to formulate a detailed roadmap with action items and timetables to get things done? I mean, we're great at doing plans, we're great at doing assessments, but it's got to train.
The Department of Social Welfare and Development
The cost of assistance, as mentioned by the first speaker, was of course enormous. This is the money that directly went into the operations and to the rescue programs for the victims of Ondoy. So all this brouhaha about the disappearance of the funds for calamity when this new government took over can be explained right away by the need to support all of these communities in January and February of 2010. So I participated in the generation of the material. There were many NGOs who came. I helped prepare the design, and this is the findings. These are some of the findings that came out of the rapid field assessment during the Ondoy. 3 out of 7 evacuation centers had no separate toilets for females and males. I'm proud to say that now we have developed all these standards. So I hope that in the coming calamity or typhoon, we are better prepared to deal with this. We are working around evacuation centers. What are the standards for setting up evacuation centers? There is a lot of debate whether they should be put in the classrooms because classes were disrupted. And UNICEF, as an agency promoting the rights of children, was so disheartened when the children could not go back to school because the families had to stay in the classroom. All these issues around calamities. And in what happened during that Ondoy, in the survey that we did, no toilet blocks, no private bathing facilities. There was a lot of talk about harassment, about peeping toms, about boys, going up the trees, watching the men and women bathing and all that stuff. There was a high incidence of substance and alcohol abuse, which posed greater risk to women and children. There were many interesting sociological phenomena that happened after this. You would imagine the trucks of San Miguel beer going to all the evacuation centers and the sudden increase in demand of alcohol. But then peddlers of drugs also were there. So the high incidence of drug peddling along the Laguna Lake area. And this had to be dealt with also. There was no special attention given to the needs of pregnant, lactating, and elderly women. No special attention to persons with disability. If you search the website of the DOH, you would see the statistics of pregnancy, delivery, deaths that happened in the context of Ondoy. And the data was simply disturbing. Another interesting finding that came out is sex trafficking. In some of the communities affected by Ondoy and in the evacuation centers, there were sex traffickers. There were people who entered and they were trying to talk to the girls, inviting them to go into this kind of job, only to find out that they will be trafficked into prostitution. So DSWD has set up some standards for evacuation centers to avoid this. Some scrupulous individuals who would prey upon the vulnerability and weakness. They would be there bringing drugs, alcohol, and then talking to girls to join them to go into all these kinds of occupation. In Region 4, which was most severely affected, this is very close to Metro Manila, out of 172 sites, 3 had reports of child abuse, 4 had reports of sexual harassment, 17 had reports of domestic violence, 48 had food distribution taking place only once a month, 5 never received any food assistance, 71 sites had supplemental feeding programs for pregnant women. So out of 172, 71 had all of this assistance, and a lot of it had to depend on the readiness of the LGU. So there was a lot of discussion about how we should support LGU. Yes, because the LGU is the frontliner when it comes to calamity. Okay, let me move very fast. In many developing countries, more women live in poverty. We have statistics for that. They bear the disproportionate burden of the effects of climate change. The domestic burdens increase, and this is one of the issues